You're on.
Okay. Let's go ahead. We'll open up with a word of prayer, and then we'll jump into our Bible study for this morning. Heavenly Father, we praise you for this beautiful weekend that you've given to us. We pray that you bless this time that we have together this morning as we study your word and look specifically at the sin of pride, or sin of envy. We pray that you'd bless this time that we have together. We ask all this in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen. All right, pride was last week. This week is envy. So we're going to do our best to work through that sheet as before. We'll kind of jump around if we need to. If you have questions as we're going through, just please raise your hand and ask them, and we'll do our best to answer. For those of you who are just coming in now, if you're out of town for a week, if you're missing, I know we've got spring breaks coming up for kids the next couple of weeks in a row. Just send an email to Lisa Borchard at chapelacrosslutheran.org, and she can send you a link that will have the video for that week's lesson, and also kind of that sheet if you'd rather just look at the sheet itself and go through the Bible study, work through that on your own. One of the things you'll learn really quickly as we work through these, each of these 7 deadly sins, one of the features of these sins is, you kind of think about them, is that they're kind of like, if you ever, I don't know, how many of you have read the book If You Give a Mouse a Cookie? It's a kid's book. So anybody with younger kids, I don't think it was around when I was little. So I've only noticed it with my kids. It's a fun little book. For those of you who haven't ever read that story or those series of stories before, the whole premise is this really greedy, needy mouse wants one thing, and he gets the one thing, and then that one thing makes him want something else, which makes him want something else, which makes him want something else. Kind of like if you ever do a home renovation, same kind of thing. I'm in the middle of renovating a bathroom, so that's why I know about this. But these 7 deadly sins kind of work in the same way, that it's what makes them stand out from many of the other sins that we could highlight is that these sins often become gateways that lead to worse and worse sin and conditions in our lives. So looking at this, just read this opening paragraph to kind of get us started, and then we'll hop into the Bible study. The meaning of envy is the emotional root and a subtle form of hate, resenting the good and rejoicing in the bad that occurs to one's neighbor. It is a social sin, hurting our relationships even to the point of murder, as in the case of Cain and Abel, and squelches joy in its tracks, as it maximizes others' good fortune and minimizes the blessings we ourselves enjoy. Envy leads us to criticize others and to attribute others' success to sheer luck, which makes us passive and, contrary to popular belief, unmotivated to work harder for ourselves. A close cousin of pride, envy weighs and ranks and compares, making our neighbors into competitors and our own blessings a prize to be boasted rather than a gift to be shared. So, good way to think about it. So as we get started with this first question I got is, how is envy different from jealousy? Because they're similar, they're somewhat related, but as we work through what the scriptures have to say about envy, it's helpful to talk about what distinguishes envy from some of these other issues. Any thoughts? Get started. Yeah.
I don't think I'd ever thought about this before till I read the question on this paper, but I guess because God is jealous, He's jealous for what is His when we turn away from Him, which I guess is different from being envious of what is not yours. So that's the contrast. And I mean, it's kind of the obvious contrast, but it is like, I'd never thought about that before.
Do you need a chair, Linda?
There's one here.
Just grab that one. Okay. Any other thoughts you guys have on the difference between envy and jealousy? So,
I think you have to love somebody to be jealous. I think about if I have my husband and somebody else is trying to get his attention, I'm kind of jealous of that.
okay.
That he's given her some attention. But I think that because it's got more love in it, and I don't think of envy. I mean, your neighbor, you can love them or you don't love them, but I think you want what they have, you kind of, I don't know how you...
Okay.
I was just going to say, envy is when you wish that you had something or somebody's relationship,
like wishing for it, and where jealousy, you're mad or hateful because it happened. It's a different of emotions.
Okay.
Like, yeah, you were saying it's not the twist.
So I think with envy and jealousy, it can be tempting to think of them synonymously. The issue that we run into when you're reading the scriptures is that, and we'll look at Exodus 34 in a second, the scriptures talk about, that God himself says, I'm a jealous God. And so, how do you compare those two?
Would jealousy be more self-focused and envy focused more on the other person?
Jealousy, how do you mean by more self-focus?
Well, when you're jealous, it's something that you feel within you, I have this, I want to keep it.
Okay. It could be. One way to think of it is that jealousy is not inherently sinful. If jealousy were inherently sinful, we'd have a problem when we read passages like Exodus 34, where God says, I'm a jealous God. Whereas envy, I would say, is inherently sinful. There's no redeeming feature to it. And I'll kind of explain a little more of that as we look more in depth in this. But open up to Exodus 34, and it's verses 10 through 16, 10 through 17. So, Exodus 34, this is a section where God is renewing his covenant with Israel. When you think of how God thought of his relationship with Israel in general, or his relationship with people today, if you remember this, what's the most common way that God likens that relationship to? I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase this. When God talks about his relationship with Israel, what human relationship does he liken it to?
Like marriage, close to marriage?
Yeah. I'm not even attempt to draw this morning. I'll save you guys from that. Yeah, so when God talks about his relationship with his people, and especially his relationship with Israel, he likens it to marriage. The book of Hosea, one of the minor prophets, is a great example of this, because in that book, God is specifically calling Hosea to go and take for himself a wife of unfaithfulness and to love her in spite of her constant infidelity. And God then uses that relationship as kind of a symbol for Israel, and says, just like Hosea loves his wife in spite of her many unfaithful times, so I love you, and I'm committed to you in spite of all the ways that you turned away from me and been unfaithful to me. So this is kind of what's going on when God says what he does here in Exodus 34. So he's renewing his covenant with Israel, and he says, behold, I am making a covenant before all your people. I will do marvels such as have not been created in all the earth or in any nation, and all the people among whom you are shall see the work of the Lord, for it is an awesome thing that I will do with you. So observe what I command you this day. Behold, I will drive out before you the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. Take care lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land to which you go, lest it become a snare in your midst. You shall tear down their altars and break their pillars and cut down their Asherim, for you shall worship no other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and when they whore after their gods and sacrifice to their gods, and you are invited, you eat of his sacrifice. And you take of their daughters for your sons, and their daughters whore after their gods, and make your sons whore after their gods. You shall not make for yourself any gods of cast metal. So verse 14 is where God says, for you shall worship no other gods, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is jealous God. This is why it's important at the very beginning to make sure that you've got distinct in your head that jealousy is not the same thing as envy. Because scripturally, God is a jealous God. So maybe we'll do it this way, how can jealousy be a positive thing? Most of the time we think of it as the negative, I think.
And God is saying, what's mine is mine, and I'm going to protect it, or I'm making sure you understand that.
Yeah. Yep. God's saying, yeah, what's mine is mine. he's not gonna play around with people who are kind of only committed halfway. He wants total and complete commitment. How else is jealousy a positive? Why do you want a chair? I got extra ones up here.
I was told I could sit there.
Oh, there you go.
Lisa told me I could sit there.
So think of it in terms of our relationships. How can jealousy be a positive for you?
I guess because it shows how much you love the other person. That,
Okay,
that you wanna give your all to them.
yeah,
Well, in this instance, you know that God is saying, you are mine, and it's important to me that we maintain this relationship, and it's in a sense he's saying, I'm your protector. You know, we know we have a God that cares about us as opposed to could care less. It's quite the opposite.
yeah. So, yeah, in terms of our human relationships, probably the closest example then is the marriage relationship, which you get some of that language here in Exodus 34, where God is warning the Israelites literally against whoring after other gods, about, following after the gods of these foreign nations that he's sending them in to dispossess their land. And so you think of our human relationships the same way. When it's a positive thing when a husband is jealous for his wife, or a wife is jealous in this way for her husband. That there's no sense in our marriages that those are supposed to be open relationships.
You know, unfortunately, modern society makes jealousy a bad thing, because when a husband is jealous of his wife, that means he's gonna take some kind of action against her.
Okay.
But what hasn't sin perverted in this world?
Yeah. Yeah, as Carl said, what hasn't sin perverted in this world? And that's a good example. I think jealousy, there is definitely the negative side, but I think the problem a lot of times is that we only see the negative side of it. And that's why when you run into a passage like this in Exodus 34, where you hear, God is a jealous God, that can trip you up if you don't really understand how that works in a positive way. Not just a negative. So when you think of envy, envy's made up of two parts, and if you're following along this, it's made up of one part desire and then another part resentment. So it's not just the desire for something that someone else has, but it's also resentment towards that person. I think how this works. So how would envy be different from greed or gluttony?
Well, those are both personal sins that normally, because greed isn't about somebody else, it's just about you obtaining your own thing.
Okay.
And same with gluttony.
And so one way to think of it is, gluttony is, I'm going to get more and more of this thing. Most of the time we think of gluttony as food, and when we get to that deadly sin, we'll talk about how it's not just food. It's not just, yeah, it's not just baking a whole tray of brownies for yourself and eating them, and not telling the rest of your family. It's about more than that, but it's about getting and just taking in all this stuff for yourself. Greed is kind of like, in that way, maybe the opposite of gluttony, in that you've got what it's the keeping of what you already have for yourself and not using that for anyone else. The difference with envy, and I think the question I've got there is a good way to think of this: how do you make a good commercial? So what's the point of commercials?
To sell your product.
Okay, sell your products.
To make people want whatever you're trying to promote.
Okay, to make people want whatever you're trying to promote.
And that they need it, or they deserve it, what our society is telling us, right?
Okay. It would have been, I was trying to find some old commercials. You think back, so the dawn of commercials have been around forever, but you think back, even 40, 50 years ago, how would you say commercials have become different from today?
They focused more on the product back then. Now it's more of the discerning part. They focus more on us and less on the product today.
Yeah, so you think about a commercial, your general thing is, I've got this product, say a smartphone that I want to sell, or whatever it happens to be. So you're trying to sell the smartphone, so you figure you're going to show the product, you're going to, talk about the specs. I'm sorry, I did. It's not a very good smartphone.
I just thought I wasn't gonna buy that one.
You're going to do a much better job of trying to sell it than that. Yeah, so, early on in advertising, we kind of approached it head on. We've got this product we want to sell, whether it's haircut products, whether it's smartphones, whether it's medicine, and we're going to show you the product, and we're just going to kind of go at it, head on like that. What's changed about the way we do advertising is people have realized the way our minds work and the way sin works is that if you want to create the desire for someone to have something, it's not just enough to show the product, to talk about how great it is. You want the person to desire not just the thing itself, but all of the intangibles that go with that thing. And so what most of advertising is today is really dealing with envy, which is not just the, I want this new product, but I want to be like that person. And that's a good way to think of like what envy is it's not just a desire for something that someone else has, it's a desire to be that person, or to be that kind of person.
And also say they want you to have a feeling that your life is not complete without it.
Yeah.
That you have to have it, otherwise you are not fulfilling what you could be. The whole concept of delayed gratification is gone.
Yeah.
Gotta have it now.
Yep. Open up to Proverbs chapter 23. Look at this one for a second. So as we're hopping into the Bible now, and we're going to in a second be looking at a case study specifically with Jacob, Rachel, and Leah. Before we get to them, it's helpful just to kind of keep in your mind that envy is not just the desire for something. So it's not just coveting something that someone else has, but it's also the desire to be that person or to be that kind of person. And this is what Proverbs 23, I think it's verse 17, picks up on. Would someone like to read that? Proverbs 23, verse 17.
Do not let your heart envy sinners, but always be zealous for the fear of the Lord.
Okay. Do not let your heart envy sinners, but be, continue in the fear of the Lord is how mine reads. Why would someone envy a sinner? Okay.
They get to do more fun stuff.
Okay, they get to do more fun stuff. Okay, why else would we envy sinners? They get to do more fun stuff.
They're living a life for them, not for God. So their whole aim is different.
Yeah. Living a life for themselves, not for God.
The glamorous life.
Okay.
Well, it looks like it.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. It looks like
Maybe an illusion. Looks like.
So, what are some great examples just from our world today of appearances of sinners or people living for themselves, where an appearance of someone living for themselves is a positive thing, but the reality is not so positive?
Wouldn't say Hollywood.
see them going to all
Okay.
these parties and having a good time. Then you find out their life's really not that great, you know what I mean? A lot of the people that do that.
Yeah. Yeah, Hollywood is a great example of that. Movie stars, you know, you think of, you know, here's a guy, for most of us who are not, you know, multimillionaires, who are not world famous, you think of, you know, if I could make my life something, and a lot of times we look up to them, we think, you know, it'd be great to have that much money, you know, enough money that you never have to really worry about working, and you could just do whatever you wanted. But then you look at the negative side, the reality of that is, you know, living for yourself and where that leads. You know, oftentimes, you know, it's loneliness, it's depression, it's drugs and alcohol and addictions. It's not so pretty.
But we all face the same consequences in the end. I mean, you either believe or you don't, so.
Yeah.
Sinner's life will lead to destruction, though, in the end, where ours is gonna be with the Lord, what happens. There's the difference in the end.
Yeah, so the difference is in the end. So the reason the Proverb 23:17 says, envy not sinners, read the whole thing, let not your heart envy sinners, but continue in the fear of the Lord all the day, is the fact that on the, you know, on the surface, we are tempted to envy sinners. And this is something that's echoed not just here in this proverb, but in other proverbs. It's echoed in the Psalms, where you get the Psalms of complaint a lot, where the people of God are complaining that it looks like there aren't consequences for people living for themselves. You know, they see sinful people and people who are taking advantage of others, and they're living the high life, and they're not receiving, you know, at least a quick temporal judgment like they may want. And it's the cry to God, Lord, why are these people who are sinners, who are living for themselves, why do they have such great lives when your people are suffering?
Maybe you explained it there, but, you know, we're all sinners, but back in the context of when that was written, are they saying the sinners are the people that are not godly people? Is that kind of the difference?
Yeah, so in this context, the sinner that they're talking about is that person that's living for themselves and not caring about God and not caring about His laws. That's the context I was talking about. All right, let's jump to Genesis 29. So there are a couple different places and a couple case studies that we can make of the scriptures and the sin of envy and where that leads negatively in our lives. Genesis 29 is just a convenient one because there's a lot of information packed in this story. We have a lot of information about the life of Jacob and these two sisters, Rachel and Leah. Another one that was mentioned earlier, Genesis 4 is the story of Cain and Abel, and that's a story where you think of that example of envy being kind of like if you give a mouse a cookie. Cain and Abel is a good example of that, where Cain envies his brother, envies the Lord, looking with favor on his brother's sacrifice, and that envy, in the end, leads to murder, where Cain murders his brother in his desire to be like him. So, Genesis 29, and we'll look at verses 30 to 35 to begin with. And I should back up and give the backstory on this. So, Jacob, in the lead up to this and the receiving of his two wives, the marrying of his two wives, what's happened is he's stolen his birthright, his brother's birthright from Esau, and then when they thought that Isaac was on his deathbed, his mom convinced him to trick his father. He dressed up like his brother, he made this big meal, and adding insult to injury, when Isaac, who can't really see at this point in his life, when he's about to give the blessing to his son, he says, you don't sound like Esau, you sound like Jacob, and are you really my son? And Jacob lies and says, yes, I'm really your son. And Isaac says, well, come close to me. And he puts his hand on the back of Jacob's neck, and Jacob has cunningly disguised himself. He's put animal skins on the back of his neck and on his arms, because Esau's a hairy guy, Jacob is not a hairy guy. And so Isaac, who can't see, he feels what feels like, he feels his son, and he feels that it's not the smooth skin of Jacob. Jacob's also put on his brother's clothes, and so he smells like Esau. And so even though Isaac can hear that it's not Jacob, his other two senses are warring against that, and he believes him, he gives him the blessing. Then Esau comes in just a few hours after that, does the same thing, prepares a meal for his father to receive the blessing, and then Isaac realizes he's been taken in, and then we're told that Esau begins to comfort himself with the thought of killing his brother after their dad dies. And so mom sends Jacob away to her parents' house, to the house of Laban, and that's where where Jacob meets Rachel and Leah. And then in a turn that makes the story and the events so ironic, Jacob, the deceiver, becomes deceived where he sees Rachel, the youngest of the two daughters of Laban. He loves her. This is your classic love at first sight. He looks at her. She's the one. What can I do for you? And Laban says, work for me 7 years, and then I'll give you my daughter. So Jacob works 7 years, and we're told that those 7 years feel like 7 days for him because he's so in love with Rachel. And then on the night of their wedding, Laban is the guy that pulls the switcheroo and deceives Jacob. And the story is what it is. You're left wondering, how can you mistake one daughter for another? I'll leave you to guess how he made that mistake. And so he wakes up in the morning, and it's Leah, not Rachel. He says to Laban, what have you done? Laban says it's not our custom to give the younger before the older. And so he says, spend the next your wedding week with Leah, and then I'll give you Rachel in return for another 7 years' labor. And so Jacob assents, and this is where we are. So in verse 30, this is the beginning of the rivalry between these two sisters and how we see envy at work in the case of Rachel. So Jacob went into Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah, and served Laban for another 7 years. When the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. And Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben, for she said, because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, for now my husband will love me. She conceived again and bore a son, and said, because the Lord has heard that I am hated, he has given me this son also. And she called his name Simeon. And again she conceived and bore a son, and said, now this time my husband will be attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore his name was called Levi. And she conceived again and bore a son, and said, this time I will praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah. Then she ceased bearing. So at the beginning of the rivalry between these two sisters, and this whole, for lack of a better word, messed up relationship between Jacob and his 2 wives, you see that God sees that Leah is not loved by Jacob in the same way that he loved Rachel, and he blesses her not once, twice, or 3 times, but 4 times with sons. And for better or worse, sons were the ones who were prized most highly in that culture. So he blesses her with these 4 sons. And this is when the envy of Rachel begins to set in. So when you jump down to to chapter 30, verses 1 and 2, so when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister. She said to Jacob, give me children, or I shall die. Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? It's interesting. So what's Rachel's response to all this? Yeah, she envies her sister. So And we talked before, it's not just the, you know, I want what that other person has, but it's, I want to be that person. And so in this moment, Jacob's love, you know, his affection for her is not enough. She wants what her sister has, and she wants to be the person her sister is, to be able to give Jacob the children that she can't. And so she says to him, give me children or I will die. And Jacob rightly says, you know, am I in the place of God? You know, it wasn't, you know, he had no ability or control over that. It was, in that sense, it was all on God, how this was going to work out. And then what follows is Rachel's, you know, what she does when not only she envies her sister, but then, you know, how she, you know, sinfully kind of makes the situation worse. So, starting in verse 3 then. So then she said, here's my servant Bilhah, go into her so that she may give birth on my behalf, that even I may have children through her. And so then what happens is these sisters begin to fight with one another, and you know, first it's Bilhah, and then it's Zilpah, who are given as wives 3 and 4 for Jacob, so that these maidservants can provide children in the name of Rachel and Leah. If you hop down to verse 14, then you'll see how this envy and this rivalry kind of makes things even worse. So in the days of the wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But she said to her, is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also? Rachel said, then he may lie with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes. When Jacob came in from the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, you must come into me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes. So he lay with her that night, and God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a 5th son. And Leah said, God has given me my wages, because I gave my servant to my husband. So she called his name Issachar. What's the deal with the mandrakes? So, Neil?
Supposed to be a love potion.
Yeah, it's a good way to think of it. BC Viagra. You know, it's supposed to be that. So it's supposed to be a plant early on that people thought would increase fertility. That, you know, so when Reuben has these mandrakes, Rachel sees them and she thinks, you know, I haven't been able to have children any other way. Perhaps if I have these, then they'll be mine. And so then she has this back and forth fight with her sister Leah, and you know, Jacob in this winds up being bartered for and sold, you know, between these 2 sisters. It's not exactly the most loving example of a God-pleasing relationship here at this point, but this is where envy took Rachel and took Leah. Then you jump down to verses 22 through 24. So Rachel has envied her sister, you know, all these years, and we've got a lot of years here that are squeezed together. And so, you know, in the first case, you've got Leah, who has 4 children before she stops having any children for a little while. And so, you know, you do the math, that's approximately 4 years have gone by where Rachel's had to see her sister have child after child after child, and she's remained without children. So now we've got more children through Bilhah, more children of Leah, more children by Zilpah, who was Leah's maidservant. So finally in verse 22, we get God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, saying, may the Lord add to me another son. What was Leah's reaction to finally getting what she wanted? So, you know, Rachel's lived for years now, always wanting to be like her sister. The one, even though she had Jacob's love, her husband's love, that wasn't enough. She wanted to be, to have everything. She wanted to be able to give her husband a son. So finally God opens up her womb, she's able to have a child, and what's her response? Neil?
Too, she thanks God for, and then she wants another.
Yeah, yeah, so, she says, yeah, she does thank God. She says, God has taken away my reproach. Calls his name Joseph, and then she says, may God add to me another. So she finally gets what she wants, but then what she wants isn't enough. And that's the other devastating effect that envy has, is that it's never satisfied. And so, a lot of times we think when we're caught in envy, we think if I just had this, or if I was just this kind of person, then I'd be happy, then I'd be satisfied, but it doesn't ever work that way. A good example of this is playing the lottery. My dad would always play the lottery every once in a while. It'd usually be when I don't know which one it was, but Powerball or whatever, when it would get really high. I remember he'd go to the gas station and buy a ticket and says, well, you can't win if you don't play. And he didn't play very often, but those would be the one times that he'd go out and buy a ticket. Have you guys ever seen the documentaries on lottery winners?
No.
So, typically speaking, what would you expect would happen after you win the lottery?
Like it's gonna be good.
Okay, yeah. You expect life is going to be good. What would you do if you won $20 million? Just curious.
I'd like to share it with others.
Okay.
Yeah.
After I
What-
pay off my debt, I'll share.
Okay. So for the average person, what do you think you would do after you won $20 million?
Go and buy a car, a new house.
Okay. Yeah.
If I was like most of the people that have, I'd blow it.
Okay.
You go deeper in debt, and now you don't have it coming, and you don't have any way to pay off this debt, and you're in a bigger mess than before you won. That's what typically happens.
Yeah. So there's a big discrepancy between what you would expect would happen and what would typically happen. So I think most people would react kind of like you either pay off your debts and then maybe buy some stuff, or you pay off your debts and then maybe give some of that money away. But what typically happens is that that's not the case. What typically happens is people go on spending sprees, they wind up more in debt. They've done these studies where they follow lottery winners and they look at them 10, 15 years after they've won a big jackpot to kind of see where they are and how they got to where they were. And in a lot of these cases, they're worse off than they were before because they took the money, they blew it, they spent it on other things, and it didn't give them the satisfaction that I think they probably imagined that they would have as they were playing, thinking, what would I do if I actually won this? And so you see envy working that way in the life of Jacob, Leah, and Rachel, and it has really devastating consequences. The one example of this, so at the very end of this story of Jacob and Leah, I think it's chapter, where's this? It's where Jacob goes to meet Esau. It's chapter 33. Okay, yeah, chapter 33 at the very beginning. So this is after Jacob wrestles with God, then he crosses the river. So Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him. So, what's Esau's thought going to be? This is, he hasn't seen, Jacob hasn't seen Esau since the day he left, years and years ago at this point. What's
He's
Jacob's
afraid.
going to be thinking?
He's afraid.
Yeah, he's afraid because my brother's coming, and it's not just my brother with the welcoming party, it's my brother with 400 armed men. And so he's afraid that his brother's going to come and exact vengeance on him in the way that he's been fearing all along. So Jacob then divides his children among Leah and Rachel, the two female servants. And this is a really sad part of the story. So he puts the servants with the children in front, then Leah with her children, and Rachel with Joseph last of all. He himself went on before them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. I guess in his defense, you could say at least he walks out in front. But what does he do with his families and his kids?
He puts them in order.
He ranks
How he
them.
loves them. How he loves them.
Yeah, he puts them in order, how he loves them. I've been bugging my mom for years that I'm her favorite because I'm the oldest, and she never really agrees. But, it's one thing, we joke about that with our parents, our kids bug us about that kind of thing. But it's another thing to actually see that, happen in real life, where, Jacob, lines up his children and his wives by, those who are the most expendable and those who are the least expendable to me. What are the devastating effects that has? So, look in the future where this takes Jacob and his family. What happens because of all of this?
They end up hating Joseph.
Okay, yeah. So they end up hating Joseph. They wind up, selling their brother into slavery, convincing their dad that he's been killed by, wild beasts. Tears that family apart. And it all starts, it starts way back. You try to figure out, where this thread begins. But in a lot of ways, it starts with this envy and this rivalry between these two sisters, Leah and Rachel, as they fight for Jacob's love. So this is what I mean when I was talking about how envy, as one of these 7 deadly sins, works kind of like if you give a mouse a cookie. It leads from one thing to the next. It's never satisfied, and it always destroys relationships. The story of Cain and Abel is the same way. It just happens quicker in that sense. Open up to John 21. This is kind of an interesting one, where we see envy at work in the life of Peter. So John 21, this takes us post-resurrection. So Jesus has already died on the cross. He's risen again. He's been meeting with his disciples. This is where Jesus famously restores Peter because Peter denied him 3 times, in the lead up to the crucifixion. And so Jesus has this conversation with John. Do you love me? Yes, Lord, I love you. Do you love me? I already told you once, I love you. If you love me, and then Peter gets offended. Yes, Lord, I love you. So this is the conversation that follows that, starting at verse 18. So Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go." This he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. After saying this, he said to him, "Follow me." So Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who also had leaned his back against him during the supper, and said, "Lord, who is it that's going to betray you?" So when Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, "Lord, what about this man?" And Jesus said to him, "If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me." So the saying spread abroad among the brothers that this disciple was not to die, yet Jesus did not say that he was not to die, but if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? So what's going on in this conversation between Peter and Jesus? Why does he ask about John, the disciple?
It sounds like jealousy.
Yeah, it's kind of incredible. You get at this point in Jesus' ministry. He's been with the disciples for 3 years. All of the back and forth about Jesus dying and rising, the disciples not getting it. All that's over with at this point because Jesus has died. He has risen again. You can imagine Jesus at this point just shaking his head, thinking, "Is this guy ever going to get it?" Because Peter turns to him and says, "Lord, what about this guy?" And Jesus says, if it's up to me, if he remains, what is that to you? And then he repeats his command, follow me. And so he says that both times in verse 19, after telling Peter, about this, and then again, he doesn't really answer Peter. He simply says to him, "But you follow me." And when you think about kind of that answer, it can seem dismissive. Jesus isn't really dealing with the question that Peter had. But when you think about envy itself and how we fight against it, it's probably actually a pretty decent answer. It's stop looking at these other people, stop looking at what's going on with them and what they've got and what you want. Just follow me. Open up to Psalm 37 because this is a passage where we talk about dealing with envy. So moving from what envy is to see an example from the scriptures to how we deal with envy ourselves. This is a psalm written by King David, and it addresses this topic. So the first couple verses actually, David writes, "Fret not yourself because of evildoers, be not envious of wrongdoers, for they will soon fade like the grass and wither like the green herb." So David is echoing, David is saying what his son Solomon will echo in that proverb that we just read, that there is a tendency by the people of God to be envious of sinners, to be envious of evildoers. At this point, what would you say is the opposite of envy?
According to the heavenly virtue, it's kindness and admiration. The opposite.
Okay.
Yeah.
Grateful,
Kindness, admiration,
grateful.
being grateful, gratefulness. Any other thoughts on what?
You're securing yourself, you're trying to take the word.
Okay. So, yes, securing yourself. Another thing I was thinking of, contentment.
Yeah,
Maybe
content, yes.
being content in who you are.
Yeah, don't need anything else.
So these next couple verses, David goes on, so he says, don't be envious of wrongdoers, don't be envious of these people, for they'll soon fade like the grass and wither like the green herb. So David is essentially saying what we see when you take the long view, that while it may look like things are going really well for that person right now, in the end, things aren't going to work out. Whether it's 10 years, 20 years down the line when you see some of the negative effects of their decisions, or in the final day, because they've lived for themselves and not for God. In the end, they're going to fade like the grass. So then he in verses 3 through 5, he highlights 3 things to do in order to fight against envy. So he says, trust in the Lord and do good, dwell in the land and befriend faithfulness, delight yourself in the Lord and he'll give you the desires of your heart, commit your way to the Lord, trust in him and he will act. So what are the 3 things that David mentions here in those 3 verses?
Well, trust several times. Trust several times. he says.
Yes, so trust several times, trust in the Lord.
I think that's
Do
kind of,
good.
I think to delight yourself is kind of like contentment, right? Like
Yeah.
You're content with what God has given you.
Neil?
Delight and commit.
Okay, yeah, and commit your way to the Lord. It's, what I find interesting, so he says, delight yourself in the Lord and he will give you the desires of your heart. What's ironic about that line coming from David? Delight yourself in the Lord and he will give you the desires of your heart.
That's you, bud.
Yeah,
Desire.
and I wonder if it, unfortunately, with this psalm, we don't have an indication of when he wrote that. So a lot of times the psalms will have little notes above them that'll tell you, this was a psalm that David wrote while he was fleeing from Saul, or this kind of thing. This one we know it's only a psalm of David. I wonder if it was something that he had written after his sin with Bathsheba, after God had restored him, because it's a quote, verse 4 is almost word for word what God says to him in his confrontation, so verse 4 says, "Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart." One of the things that God says in His condemnation of David is, you stole this man's wife, you killed the man in order to cover it up, and if you desired these things, if you had only asked for them, then I would have given you those things that you were running after. But in trying to take them for yourself and to take them in a sinful way, now here are the consequences that you're going to face. Carl.
I think in this verse, you need to make sure you take the verse, both first and last parts together, because there's also some scripture in the New Testament that talks about He will give you the desires of your heart, but it's always preceded by lust after the Lord, if you will.
Okay.
Delight in the Lord. And if that's the desire of your heart, He'll give it. He doesn't say, trust me and I'll give you these other things.
Yeah, so
because those aren't your desire. The Lord is your desire.
Yeah, so He'll give you the desires of your heart is sandwiched between those two things, delight in the Lord and committing yourself to the Lord. James actually highlights that verbatim when he talks about the thoughts that some people have had, why am I not getting the things that I'm praying for? Why am I not getting the things that I ask for? And James says, the reason you're not getting what you're asking for is because you're asking with the wrong motives that you can spend it on your own sinful passions and pleasures. And so it's the desires of your heart, assuming that you're delighting in the Lord and seeking after Him and committing yourself to His ways. If your desire, the desire of your heart is to win the lottery and to never have to work a day of your life and sit on the beach, don't count on it. Yeah. Which after this winter is a real shame. Yeah, it is a conditioned thing, so the Lord will give you the desires of your heart. But that's also something I think you find when you look at this way. What does contentment look like? So I think most people would say that they want to be content with their life, right?
Right.
I think most people want that. Maybe not everybody. But what are the wrong ways we go about trying to get contentment?
If my needs are met, I guess I feel pretty content. Now, there's always things I would like to have, but if
Okay.
I have all my needs met, I'm pretty content. That's me.
That's
Okay.
like separating the wants from the needs and going after the wants.
What else? How?
So much could be said, but it's,
Yeah.
we're older people here, but you look at the younger generation, the kids in grade school, high school, there's so much bombarded. Even something as simple as a Nike commercial and having the Nike shoes and Nike high school, everything is about, I gotta have it, I gotta have it.
Yeah.
And that's not contentment. It's like contentment is understanding you live within your means, and that's probably what most of us were grown up being taught.
Okay.
You live within your means, and in today's world, especially with Facebook, everybody's out there flashing all this great life, and some of the people that I'm on Facebook with, very few do I really know, but the ones that I do know, it's like, okay, they're putting on the best of the best show on Facebook. Now, some people will spill their guts there and say, oh my gosh, I'm hurting, which
Yeah.
you reach out to, but other people, it's all about the flash of today.
Okay. How many of you heard about the Fire Festival? It's F-Y-R-E. If you have Netflix, I think it's on Netflix with the documentaries on. I had heard a little bit about it, not so much when it was going on. So the thing with the Fire Festival, how many of you have never heard of that before? Maybe most of you, I'll explain it then. So what happened was, probably 3 years ago now? 4 years ago, I think, is what it was. young entrepreneur from New York decided he wanted to run a music festival and didn't really want to do a lot of the legwork for it, thought, it wouldn't be that difficult to pull off, and so what he did was he invited a bunch of models and people who have a lot of followers on Instagram and Twitter out to this island, and they did kind of like a week getaway. They were taking videos, and then they were posting on their Instagram and Twitter with the hashtag Fire Festival, and they were building up this big music festival that was going to happen down in the Caribbean. It was going to be this 5-star thing, 5-star experience, with all these different music groups, and all this. So they put all this effort into the publicizing for it, and then didn't actually put very much effort into planning the thing. And so what ended up happening was, at the end, so if you watch the documentary, it's actually fascinating because it's a documentary of, what happens when you've got a guy with a great idea and no follow-through, and kind of what happens with that. So on the one side, you've got this debacle of a festival that begins to unfold. On the flip side, in the lead-up to this, you've got literally thousands of mostly younger people who have bought tickets for this thing and bought into this idea that was sold through the commercials that this is kind of the lifestyle that you can have for this week, and it was envy writ large on on this scale. And then what ended up happening was they were the people that were involved in this were telling the front guy, you got to pull the plug, you got to pull the plug. We don't have the accommodations that we promised people that would be there. We don't have the acts that people promised that there would be there. Everybody flies down to this island. Remember which island it was?
It was Pablo.
It was a private island.
Yeah, it was built as a private island, and then it was switched at the last moment. Everybody gets there, and then they've got these little dome tents that everybody's sleeping in, and not the 5-star accommodations that they were expecting. They don't have the food service for the people. They don't have the bathrooms for the people. They've got no way for the people to get off the island, and so the authorities wind up locking a good portion of them in the airport because they don't really know what to do with them. It's just a debacle. But when you see it when you look at something like that, that's where envy gets you, when you're searching after that, where you think, my contentment is going to be if I just get this thing, or if I'm just this kind of person. You see it in a small scale there, but people unfortunately sometimes live their whole lives stuck in envy, always wanting to be someone that they're not content in who God has made them to be, and it just leads from one disaster to the next. Even if they get the thing that they want, they're not ever fully satisfied with it. And that's the danger of it.
There's one verse, and I can never remember the key words to find it. I don't know if it's in Deuteronomy, but it's something that I know I've got on Facebook somewhere, but it focuses on us looking at what God has planned for us alone and not worrying about other people. And it's just a little passage that I think is great, and it's one of the few in the Bible that really focuses us on what God has planned for us, so that we are content and not turning us away from the envious lifestyle.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not
I'll find
looking
it.
for it. Yeah, if you find it,
Yeah.
bring it next week, or
Yeah.
let me know. That sounds like an interesting one. So as we look forward to next week, down at the bottom, so this is kind of a question for you to consider throughout this week, is what or whom do you envy? Because as we're going through these 7 deadly sins, we can't be completely clinical. It's not like we can just look at them and say, these are sins other people have, and I don't really struggle with them myself. I mean, we're sinful, we struggle with all of these at different times as well. And so think, and really think, whom do you envy? What kind of person do you want to be? What are the things you're envying? And then pray this week, if it's a specific person in your life, like I envy my coworker because of the life that she has, or because of the life that he has. Pray specifically for that person, for their good. Because that's another thing that we see with envy is that it, you know, in our relationships, it does twist them, and that second part of it is resentment. And so pray for that person, pray for their good, and then the second part, pray that God would give you contentment in who you are, in where He's placed you, and the things that He's given you. So that's your homework for this week. All right, God bless. We'll begin with our next one next Sunday.